Welcome back to the Deep 404. There's a lot to talk about today. The news in the last 24 hours from Ukraine, Russia, from the South Pacific, France, everywhere. There is a lot going on. I'll start with the New York Times article, which has come out now and claimed that the CIA have established 12 secret bases within Ukraine. Basically, the CIA, it's now been reported, have been operating in Ukraine since 2014. Around 2016, the reporting says the CIA began training an elite Ukrainian special forces unit known as Unit 2245, which captured Russian drones and communications equipment so that CIA technicians could reverse engineer them and crack Moscow's encryption systems. According to the New York Times, one of the officers in this unit, 2245, is the current head of Defense Intelligence, Krylo Budanhov. There is a report from Ivan Bakanov, who was then the head of Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency, the S.B.U, that without them, the CIA, there would have been no way for us to resist the Russians or to beat them. So this story just goes to show and back up what a lot of people have said for a long time, is that there has been Western intelligence, US intelligence interests in Ukraine since at least 2014, when Victoria Nuland was there and the Maidan coup occurred. These 12 secret bases reportedly along the border of Ukraine with Russia, their locations, I'm not certain on where they are. It'll be interesting to understand where they are now in terms of the revised borders due to this conflict. William Burns, the CIA chief, made another visit. I think it's his 10th trip to Ukraine in the past 2 years. He was just there here this week. I don't know if this may have had anything to do with the article coming out from the New York Times at this stage, but it does then, of course, lead credence to the story that part of the reason why Russia entered into this conflict with Ukraine was because of US and NATO presence growing in Ukraine. A lot of people have said that that's not the case. A lot of people have even said after Russian President Vladimir Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson that NATO had nothing to do with it, because Vladimir Putin had spent time saying that his reason for going in there was because of his desire to assist the peoples of the Lugansk and Donetsk areas who were fighting for their independence against Ukraine. I think both are true. I think that that's definitely part of the reason why Russia went in there. I also think that a big part of the reason is because NATO was appearing on their doorstep and growing there. Even Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said that this is Putin's reason for this conflict. It's because NATO was growing in strength there. NATO, of course, arm in arm with the United States, being the primary member of NATO, and hence the CIA. So an interesting one there. In the field of military intelligence and groups like the CIA, other interesting article has come out that Krylo Budanhov, who was reportedly in this group or this unit that was special forces unit that was trained by the CIA back in 2016, Krylo Budanhov, who's now the head of the GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate head of, he has in an interview stated two things that contradict directly with what the United States has been saying. One Western report has been that Russia has been using like ground-launched Iranian missiles. Budanhov has said no, none. There's no evidence of that at all. He has also come out and said that he believes, and his intelligence department believes, that Navalny's death was not that he was killed by Putin, not by some magical one-inch punch or anything ridiculous like that, but he suffered a blood clot and died from that. There are a number of people speculating what may have caused his blood clot. perhaps something that I can't discuss too openly on YouTube, but I'm sure many of you will have an indication of what those people are suggesting may have been the cause of his blood clot. But again, this is interesting in that Budanhov, CIA trained, it seems, intelligence leader for Ukraine, is now coming out and negating aspects of the Western propaganda, which is aimed directly at making Putin and Russia look like bad guys, making Putin look like a bad guy for having killed Navalny leading up to the upcoming Russian presidential election, and increasing the pressure on Iran and Russia, saying there's a stronger allegiance between them than there may actually be. Why is Budanhov doing this? Well, perhaps he's had enough of the lack of funding from the Americans. Maybe that is why he is starting to vocalize these things publicly. Who knows? But interesting. Now, other news, I'm just going to go to our other screen here. Other news here is that reports that the first US Abrams tank has been destroyed in Ukraine. This is allegedly a screenshot from a drone. I believe that what may have happened was that for one reason or another, the Abrams broke down, whether it came under attack and that caused it to fail and break down, or it just broke down, not handling the conditions. And then it may have been then further attacked after being abandoned by its crew, with grenades being dropped into it perhaps. I saw some later footage just before doing the show, which seemed to indicate that it had actually cooked off and completely exploded due, I imagine, to these grenades that have been dropped into it. So, not a great outing for the Abrams. Now, you can't blame the Abrams. Any tank sent out in this conflict against the Russian Lancets and the like, FPV drones and Kamikaze drones, is going to suffer. This is the first conflict where we've really seen this type of drone war against armoured pieces of equipment like tanks. In the same way, it's the first time we've really seen this happen in the sea with the Black Sea Fleet and the unexpected number of successes that Ukraine has had, or failures that the Black Sea Fleet has had in terms of protecting its ships against drones. So the Abrams, not unexpected that this would happen after Leopards and Challengers have been destroyed. Not good for the US manufacturer of Abrams. Reportedly, Taiwan, I actually did see quite a good meme today of someone pulling a rather worried face saying Taiwan, after seeing this footage, realizing that they have just bought 108 of these Abrams, but I believe a more lightly armored version. That would be a real worry, because clearly the Taiwanese now know that those tanks they've just bought will have limited survivability unless they are able to overcome the opposing threat, will be Chinese threat in their case, of FPV and Kamikaze drones. And if they can't overcome that, then they've just spent a lot of money on tanks that will ultimately most likely suffer this fate. It's not to say that these tanks won't survive for some time, but this one hasn't survived long. There have been Abrams in Ukraine for some months now. I think there's some reports going back to even September, that early, that they may have been there from last year, but they have been kept well back and well protected. For some reason, this one has reportedly turned up in the Avdiivka section, so just west of Donetsk, where we've just seen Avdiivka fall to the Russians. Very heavy fighting. Now the Ukrainians being pushed back, being routed. It seems as though they have not been able to prepare sufficient defences behind the line of Avdiivka. Now that fortified township has fallen, they are scrambling to try to hold a line with reports from Ukrainian channels as well as Russian channels of continued Russian advances west of Avdiivka. And real concern coming out of some of the Ukrainian channels about when that will stop, and some suggestions from some social media sources that it may not stop in a hurry. One piece of evidence that was given to that point today was footage of Ukrainian soldiers attempting to roll out strands of barbed wire and coming under FPV drone attack. And the caption on it was, "You can't be preparing defences only 10 kilometres away from the front line because you're going to come under attack of FPV drones. You know, these defences should have been prepared 30, 50, 100 kilometres back previously so that they're not being prepared now effectively." So this loss of an Abrams, again, another demonstration of how drones play an asymmetric, outsized impact. Reportedly, an Abrams is worth somewhere around $9 million, and the drone that destroyed it probably no more than $30,000. So in terms of the economics of war, something needs to be done with tanks like this to ensure their survivability against far cheaper drones. And remember, while these tanks are probably getting more expensive to make them more heavily armoured and add more systems to them to make them less likely to be killed by a drone, those drones are becoming mass-produced and are getting cheaper. So the economic differential here is just going to grow, I think. So interesting to see what's going to happen with tanks. Will tanks become downsized to become faster, smaller, autonomous drones themselves in the future, and we'll lose these big, bulky, heavy things that you have to armor like this so as to protect a crew of 3, which many of these tanks, I'm not sure what an Abrams has, but many of them have a tank or a crew of 3 or something like that. Being able to remove those 3 completely changes the dynamics and the design of a tank like this. For one thing, you can reduce the height, and reducing the height of a tank is a good thing. Big, tall tanks and armoured pieces of equipment stand out really well on flat plains, on areas where it is winter time and perhaps the foliage has been gone from the trees, so you don't get that for cover. So this, no doubt, we will see evolution here, and it may be the same that we see evolution in terms of the size of naval boats in the future. They will either need to be able to ensure their safety from small, nimble drones, or they themselves will need to shrink in size and not play the same massive firepower role that battleships have played in the past and the aircraft carriers have played in the past. And instead, there may be a move to, instead of expensive aircraft like F-35s being deployed off aircraft, less of a reliance on that and more of a reliance on disposable drones. Instead of $30, $50 million, $80 million planes or whatever they are, you might buy a whole bunch of $300,000 disposable UAV drone craft, which they can maybe drop a bomb, they can target something, they may be a kamikaze, they may be reusable, but if you lose them, it's not the same as losing such an expensive piece of kit. Evolution, we're already starting to see evolution in the drone space, drones moving into different roles, kamikaze ones that are reconnaissance only, lighter, able to go higher, not carrying the weight of a weapon on it, enforcer drones, ones which are now being equipped with shotguns and nets to be able to then take out other drones in the sky. So that has happened. Also, a NASAMS launcher. The NASAMS is the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, the short to medium range ground-based air defense system. One of those was reportedly lost today as well. The Ukrainians lost one of these launcher units. Each system, much like a Patriot, has multiple elements. Each one of these can have up to 3 missile launchers, 1 radar, 1 vehicle for transporting it, I guess, and 1 camera vehicle. But in this case, I believe is one of these launcher systems that was destroyed. Continuing the bad news in terms of losses on the Ukrainian front today, like high-profile pieces. A Swedish Archer SPG, like a self-propelled gun. One of these, there's been video confirmation of one being destroyed today, and a French Caesar self-propelled gun. Also, one of these reportedly has been destroyed in Ukraine today. So, not a great day on the front line there in terms of high-profile pieces of equipment being lost. Now, in other news from the area, There are reports coming out, and Slovakian Prime Minister FICO seems to be heading this, but there are some comments from French President Emmanuel Macron that EU and NATO members are considering going to war in Ukraine, like they're considering putting troops into Ukraine. Slovakian Prime Minister PM Fico has said that he has seen a restricted document listing topics to be discussed in Paris at a conference which is going on at the moment there. He has said that the topics in there would send shivers down your spine. These topics, he says, imply that a number of NATO and EU member states are considering sending troops to Ukraine. He goes on to say, I can't say for what purpose or what they would do there. Fico also says that, according to him, the war in Ukraine is not going as expected by the EU and NATO. I think a lot of us are aware of that now, but he's openly saying this. He suggests that this Paris meeting is confirmation that the Ukraine strategy of the West has completely failed. He didn't go on to provide details about that, but I think a lot of that is obvious. He suggests that this plan risks escalating the Ukrainian war and stressed that Slovakia would not participate in putting troops into Ukraine to fight against the Russians there. So in a separate interview, French President Macron has discussed sending 250,000 AI attack drones equipped with fragmentation grenades to Ukraine by the end of the year. This in itself is just an insane thing. Just the way that these EU and NATO nations aren't looking to stop this conflict, but just to increase and continue this conflict. 250,000 drones being sent, AI drones with fragmentation grenades on them. Anyhow, Macron was then questioned about putting French troops into Ukraine to fight against Russia. And he would not rule that out, saying all things need to be considered and could be on the table and things are being planned and discussed. Didn't say it would happen, but also didn't say that it wouldn't happen. So the war machine looks like it's going to roll on through Europe. Apart from Orban of Hungary and Fico of Slovakia, there seem to be very few voices in EU and NATO willing to suggest that stoking the fires of this conflict is not something that should be done, and that a way to get out of it should be found. I saw some reports today that Ukrainian President Zelensky is planning to have peace talks. He'll organise and lead peace talks in Switzerland, I believe. Of course, Russia won't be invited to those peace talks. So again, this is just some sort of a charade for him to be able to present to the Western media and for the Western media to be able to regurgitate that, look, Zelensky's calling for peace. It's Putin who doesn't want to negotiate. He doesn't want peace. We're having peace talks. And guess what? Putin didn't even turn up to them. Now, of course, he's not being invited to them. But I imagine that's the way that this will end up being spun in the West. And this is not the first time. There have been a number of meetings like this where Ukraine has considered them to be peace talks. But at the most recent one of these meetings, even the Chinese there, and I believe a number of other countries suggested that this wasn't really peace talks. Whatever it wasn't peace talks, because for that to be the case, Russia needed to be there. So that is an escalation that we're seeing. Now, moving away from Ukraine for a moment and talking more now here about US and China. So just going to our map here. So moving away from where we normally spend our time, coming down here into more of my hometown, we've got reports that there has been a very senior diplomatic delegation, US delegation, sent to the Solomon Islands involving Ambassador Daniel Crittenbrink, who is Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Reportedly, he has been down there to speak to the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands about their recent security agreement with China. He has suggested to the Solomon Islands leadership that while they may feel that their security agreement with China is fine and provides them with some level of domestic security, actually the US see things differently. And he's quoted as saying, this is Ambassador Daniel Crittenbrink is quoted as saying, "Of course, we have respect for the Solomon Islands sovereignty, but we also wanted to let them know that if steps were taken to establish a de facto permanent military presence, power projection capabilities, or military installation," this is a Chinese one, Chinese military installation, "then we, the United States, would have significant concerns and we would very naturally respond to those concerns." When he was questioned on whether that would involve military action, he didn't rule out that military action might be something that the US would use in this case. So the US consider that the Solomon Islands security guarantee with China threatens the security of the United States, the regional security of the United States and its allies. Now, its main allies in the area is Australia, is the main one, New Zealand, but really it's Australia here. What's interesting is that a Chinese base in the Solomon Islands is considered by the United States to be a potential regional security threat to the United States and its allies, but Ukraine joining NATO is not to be considered any threat to Russia. So this just shows the hypocrisy of the current US administration and military and their position on things like this. Obviously, NATO or Ukraine moving to NATO is a threat to Russian security. Likewise, a Chinese military base in the Solomon Islands is a threat to the US and their allies within the region. And in much the same way as many people have said, if the Chinese were to convince the Mexicans or the Canadians, perhaps more likely, to join a security guarantee with them and allow them to put Chinese missiles on the border with America, that would be considered a threat by the Americans, and rightly so, in much the same way that Ukraine and looking to move to NATO has been a threat to Russia. So seeing the US and Chinese conflict, again, not calming down, but perhaps extending now further into the South Pacific. This will be interesting to see what happens here. The Solomon Islands are going to be caught between a rock and a hard place. They are a tiny nation. They have signed this agreement with China. It was a huge surprise to the Australians at that time. They couldn't believe that the Solomon Islands would have done that. But now that it has happened, they are going to come under immense pressure from both China to honour that agreement and from the United States to throw that agreement out. Perhaps if played very deftly by the leadership of the Solomon Islands, it may work in their benefit. They may be able to garner some level of security and investment for themselves, but if played badly, then they may find themselves, being wrecked, being squashed out of trade deals with both the US and its allies and China and its allies. Who knows how this will go, but I personally wouldn't want to be the Solomon Islands right now with this emerging for them there. Other news. President Putin reportedly is restructuring the armed forces around the Moscow and Leningrad districts. In the past, the Moscow and Leningrad districts reportedly were combined together, but now, due to concern about Finland's activities, its rhetoric now, what's happening in that whole northern Baltic area with Sweden, Iceland, all in that area there. Norway, Finland and Sweden, all in that area there. The rhetoric that's coming out of there, the Russians apparently now making some moves to counter that in some way by restructuring their forces. I haven't read into the details of this, but my rough understanding is that this separation would allow there to be some sort of a buffering, an establishment of the Leningrad district and then the Moscow district, and providing some sort of buffer in the way that these forces will be managed differently and separated differently. But again, just more escalations around this. Looking at Russia now, they really do seem to now be preparing for a conflict with NATO. And it seems to be becoming, ridiculous as it is, more and more likely that NATO are willing to engage in something like that. Those earlier comments from Slovakian Prime Minister FICO, that he's seen a classified document, and that document suggesting that some NATO and EU countries are looking or considering putting their troops into Ukraine. Now, we know that there are already troops from these nations in there in smaller numbers and often tagged as being mercenaries, but there have been a number of reports that they are in crucial roles there in the control and operation of certain pieces of equipment, like Patriot missile systems, perhaps, things like that. But if this becomes overt, and, for example, you had Polish troops being sent in there, even if those Polish troops aren't necessarily operating on the front line, if they are there as Polish troops engaged in the conflict, they become a target for Russia. And if Russia targets them, then this just heightens again and exacerbates the situation, and is more likely then to allow Poland, or the West, assuming this example of Poland, to be able to go to the Western media and say, look at what Russia has done. We had some guys in there, they were just doing a peacekeeping mission, and now the Russians have bombed them, hit them with a missile. That's it. We need to get support to send in more people. So this really could evolve into a European conflict with the NATO nations on side against Russia. And then once that begins, we wait to see what happens next. If, for example, a conflict expands in the Middle East and Iran becomes involved, now Turkey and Iran are under some sort of pressure. It's possible then that Turkey may falter and Turkey may fall out of NATO and to the side of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and its Muslim nations around the world in a fight against Israel and the United States. If that were to happen and you see that fracturing of NATO, then you might also start to see things like Slovakia, Hungary, starting to separate themselves from NATO activity. You might see Serbia declaring support for Russia, and you start to get a pocket then within Middle Europe, the European nations, which are no longer completely aligned with NATO. And so you could end up with just a war, a European war, just embroiling all of Europe, and not necessarily being drawn just on one line in Ukraine with Russia, but perhaps fracturing out into other areas of Europe too. So there's all that happening. And then on to a couple more speculative topics. One of them is that there are reports that the Houthis may have damaged some undersea cables. I'll just go back to a map here. You can have a look. This is a little difficult to see. I apologise, this map. But over here, this is Egypt, and Sudan and Ethiopia. This is Yemen just here. This is the Arabian Sea, Saudi Arabia here. And this is the Red Sea. But what these coloured ribbons running through here are undersea communication cables. So cables connecting areas of Europe up here, down through the Suez and the Red Sea, and connecting into India and Pakistan, Iran, and all this sort of thing. So there is talk. At this stage, I feel that it is mostly likely Israeli propaganda. It seems as though the bulk of this is coming from Israeli sources, and they are suggesting that the Houthis have damaged up to 4 undersea cables: the AAE-1, the CECOM, the Europe-India Gateway, EIG, and a TGN system, and that they've been damaged off the Red Sea of the coast. In the Red Sea off the coast of Yemen. The reason I'm suggesting that perhaps why this may not be the case and why this may be propaganda, obviously the Israelis have got good reason to try to make problems for Yemen and the Houthis, and if they could do that by inflaming Europe and saying, hey, you're going to lose your internet connectivity because the Yemenis have done this, that would be a valid reason for them to be raising this. But the reason I'm suggesting something like that might be the case is because it was 12, 15 hours ago that I started to see this, and in following up just before doing this show, there are only some very small reports of internet disruptions, and they seem to be localized. And in one of those cases, the provider has suggested that, yes, while they do have an outage, they don't know what the cause is. They're not able to say, yep, it's because one of our cables has been damaged in this area. So this may just be some propaganda we're seeing, but newsworthy in itself, in that it did get out there for a while, and that it is an interesting point to consider, because we do see that there is this choke point here where all of these connections run right under the noses of the area that the Houthis do control. So should they wish to, it may well be within their capabilities to actually cut and destroy these, and then cause some level of disruption. The whole world is connected now by internet and phone, and if that is stopped, and stopped significantly here, which it looks like quite a bit could be stopped in this case, there would be some disruption to business if that were to occur. However, it may not make sense for Yemen to damage all of these, or to damage some of them, because of the downstream effects around these other nations here into Iran and Pakistan, India and Yemen themselves. They may not wish to cut that and damage themselves, perhaps. So another thing, again, which, look, hard to tell if this is a real story or not, but it is getting a lot of traction, which are that there are reports that a man has been arrested in Moscow who reportedly was paid $4,000 by a Ukrainian source to plant an explosive on Tucker Carlson's vehicle while Tucker was in Moscow to perform the interview with President Putin. Now, the man has been arrested. There's some video of him admitting to this crime. I can't confirm if this is correct or not. There is a lot of speculation that it may be correct, because this happened on the 31st of January. When Tucker was there, there is talk that on that same day, Victoria Nuland was in Kiev, and that she may have given the go-ahead on this. As more details come out, if this is confirmed and found to be true, then it's a very big story, because it is a demonstration of Ukraine overstepping what you would expect to normally be a red line for the United States, which would be an attack on an American citizen. Now, we've seen that the United States can turn a blind eye to this when they want to. For example, Gonzalo Lira, who passed away recently in Ukrainian prison, reportedly due to neglect in that prison, after he had given a video premonition of his death some months beforehand, when he had tried to escape from Ukraine, when he'd suggested if he wasn't able to do this that he would die there. And that ultimately did happen. He's an American citizen, and yet there has been no word from the US State Department about Gonzalo Lira, other than a few comments last year with them basically just dismissing any claims about his safety, and that they hadn't really heard it and probably wasn't true. So, as I say, if the Tucker Carlson one does bear out and actually does become verified, then it's a big story, and just showing the way that the West is willing to bend what it would have previously considered to be unbendable red lines in order to enable the conflict in Ukraine to continue. All right, I'm just going to leave that one there for tonight. Hey, it's been good talking to you. For those of you who are interested and who have subscribed, I've set up channel memberships. I'm going to start putting in some members-only content there. If you're interested, put something in the comments. Let me know what you might be interested in seeing or hearing about, and I'll see what I can do there. But I hope you have a good night. I look forward to talking to you again soon.